she carved her own wooden leg from a fence post. But when winter came and desperation drove her to consider selling herself to survive, the whole town discovered what she was truly worth. Will a scarred carpenter's life savings be enough to prove that broken things can become beautiful when they choose to heal together? Blood mixed with sawdust beneath Evangeline's knees as she crawled toward the barn door, her left leg ending in a mangled mess where the threshing machine had caught her. 6 months later, she still woke up some mornings forgetting what the metal teeth had taken from her. The October wind cut through her thin shawl as she limped down Millbrook's main street, using a walking stick carved from an old fence post. Her wooden leg knocked against every uneven board on the sidewalk, announcing her approach to anyone within earshot. Children stopped their games to stare. Women pulled their skirts aside as if her misfortune might be catching. Kansas Territory in 1867 wasn't kind to broken things. Horses with lame legs got shot. Wagons with broken wheels got burned for firewood. People with missing pieces learned to make do or starve trying. Henderson's General Store stood like a fortress of respectability at the corner of Main and First Street. Mrs. Henderson watched Evangeline approach through the front window. Her round face creased with the particular expression people wore when they wanted to help but didn't know how. The bell above the door chimed as Evangeline pushed inside, grateful for the warmth that smelled of coffee beans and dried apples. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Henderson called from behind her counter, where she was arranging bolts of fabric in shades of blue and green. "How are you managing?" The question everyone asked, but nobody really wanted answered. Evangeline forced a smile. "Well enough, thank you." But they both knew it was a lie. The Patterson farm had been sold to pay medical bills 3 weeks ago. Evangeline now lived in a tiny room above Murphy's Tavern, surviving on charity meals and the occasional odd job that didn't require 2 good legs. The arithmetic was simple and cruel. No farm meant no income. No income meant no future. And winter was coming fast. Mrs. Henderson busied herself with unnecessary tidying, the way people do when they're working up courage for difficult conversations. "I heard tell the widow Morrison might be looking for help with her housework," she said finally. "Nothing too strenuous, mind you. Just light cleaning and such." Evangeline had heard the same rumor, along with whispers about how the widow's arthritis made even simple tasks painful. But she'd also heard Mrs. Morrison tell her sister that she couldn't afford to pay wages, only room and board. Room and board wouldn't buy the medicine that kept infection from setting into her damaged leg. It wouldn't buy the heavy coat she'd need when snow started falling in earnest. "I appreciate you thinking of me," Evangeline said, pulling a folded newspaper from her coat pocket. "But I'm hoping something else might work out." She spread the paper on the counter, pointing to an advertisement circled in pencil. "Seeking domestic companion. Room, board, and wages provided. Apply Silver Dollar Saloon, noon Tuesday." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted from sympathy to concern. "Evangeline, dear, you can't be serious. That establishment isn't, well, it's not suitable for a young lady." The Silver Dollar served more than whiskey, though nobody spoke about it directly. The upstairs rooms housed women who smiled too brightly and dressed too boldly. Women who had run out of other choices, just like Evangeline was running out now. "The advertisement mentions domestic work," Evangeline said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Cooking and cleaning. Nothing improper." Mrs. Henderson reached across the counter and covered Evangeline's hand with her own. "Child, men don't advertise for housekeepers in saloons. Whatever they're offering, it isn't what a good Christian girl should consider." Heat rose in Evangeline's cheeks. Good Christian girls had families to protect them, or husbands to provide for them, or at least 2 working legs to earn their keep. Good Christian girls didn't face the choice between starvation and sin. "I'm just going to hear what they have to say," Evangeline said, folding the newspaper and tucking it back into her coat. Nothing more than that. But as she made her way to the door, Mrs. Henderson's voice followed her. "Some prices are too high to pay, no matter how desperate we get." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of snow from the north. Evangeline pulled her shawl tighter and began the slow journey back to Murphy's Tavern, each step on the uneven boardwalk, sending jarring pain up her damaged leg. She passed the blacksmith shop, where she used to bring her father's tools for sharpening, the church, where she'd attended every Sunday, until shame made the pews feel too public, the schoolhouse, where she'd once dreamed of teaching children their letters. All of it felt like memories from someone else's life now. At the edge of town, she paused beside the cemetery, where her parents rested under simple wooden crosses. The ground around their graves had started to freeze, and someone had left wildflowers that were already turning brown at the edges. "I don't know what to do, Papa," she whispered to the October air. "You always said there was honest work for anyone willing to do it. But what happens when nobody wants to hire someone who can barely walk?" A family of sparrows landed on her father's grave marker, pecking at scattered seeds some kind soul had left. Even the birds found ways to survive winter that she couldn't manage. The walk back to Murphy's Tavern took twice as long as it should have, partly because of her leg, and partly because she dreaded returning to the cramped room that smelled of other people's desperation. The tavern keeper, Murphy himself, nodded as she passed through the main room, where a handful of men nursed their afternoon drinks, and avoided eye contact with her. Her room was barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand, with one small window that looked out over the alley where cats fought over scraps from the kitchen. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the newspaper again, staring at the circled advertisement until the words blurred together. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Tomorrow at noon, she would learn exactly what kind of domestic work required advertising in a saloon. Part of her already knew the answer, just as part of her knew she was running out of alternatives. She reached under the bed and pulled out a small wooden box that contained everything valuable she had left in the world. Her mother's wedding ring, a silver locket with her parents' photograph inside, and $3.47 in coins. Enough to buy food for perhaps another week if she was careful. Not enough to survive until spring. The wooden leg she'd carved from a fence post leaned against the wall beside her washstand. It wasn't pretty or comfortable, but it was hers proof that she refused to simply give up and die. She'd whittled it during long evenings when pain kept her awake, shaping the wood with the same knife her father had used to carve whistles for her when she was small. Looking at it now, she wondered if refusing to give up was just another form of foolishness. Maybe there came a point when surrender was the only sensible choice left. A knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. Murphy's voice called through the thin wood. "Miss Patterson? There's someone here to see you." Evangeline frowned. Nobody visited her anymore, not since the accident had transformed her from a respectable farmer's daughter into an object of pity. She smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find Murphy standing in the narrow hallway beside a tall man in a dusty coat. "This here's Daniel Reed," Murphy said, already backing toward the stairs. "Says he's got business with you." The stranger removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with premature gray and eyes the color of storm clouds. A long scar ran from his left ear to his jawline, old and white against weathered skin. He carried a toolbox in one hand and wore the simple clothes of a working man. "Miss Patterson," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "Dr. Morrison mentioned you might be in need of some carpentry work." Evangeline stared at him in confusion. "I didn't ask Dr. Morrison for anything." "No, ma'am. I expect you didn't. But he noticed your walking stick and thought you might benefit from some modifications to help with." He gestured vaguely toward her leg without making it seem shameful, getting around more easily. "I can't afford to pay a carpenter," she said bluntly. "I can barely afford to eat." Daniel's expression didn't change. "Payment's been arranged. Anonymous benefactor who thinks everyone deserves a chance to live with dignity." The words hit her like a slap, though she suspected he hadn't meant them that way. Anonymous charity was still charity, and charity was what people gave to those who couldn't take care of themselves. "I don't need anyone's pity," she said, starting to close the door. Daniel put his hand against the door frame, not forcefully, but firmly. "It's not pity, Miss Patterson. It's one person recognizing that another person has value, regardless of circumstances." Something in his tone made her pause. When she looked at his face again, she saw not the condescending sympathy she'd grown to hate, but something else entirely, respect mixed with understanding, as if he knew something about fighting to maintain dignity when the world seemed determined to strip it away. "What kind of modifications?" she asked cautiously. "Railings for your stairs? Maybe some adjustments to make doorways easier to navigate. And I'd like to take a look at that walking stick of yours. Fine carving work, but I might be able to make some improvements." Despite herself, Evangeline felt a spark of pride. Nobody had complimented her carving before. Most people were too busy pitying her to notice she'd made something functional from raw wood. "I suppose you could look," she said, stepping aside to let him into her tiny room. Daniel examined her carved walking stick with the attention of someone who understood both wood and craftsmanship. He ran his fingers along the grip she'd shaped to fit her hand, tested the weight and balance, and nodded approvingly. "This is good work," he said. "You've got natural skill, but I could add some padding here, maybe adjust the length for better support." As he spoke, Evangeline found herself studying him more closely. His hands were scarred and calloused from years of hard work, but his movements were precise and economical. When he looked at her, his eyes held something she hadn't seen in months. Simple human respect, without pity or condescension. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why would someone pay you to help me?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, still examining her walking stick. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and deliberate. Maybe because they remember what it feels like to need help and have everyone look right through you like you don't exist anymore. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the cheerful charity she'd grown to hate, but something deeper and more complicated recognition from someone who understood what it meant to be discarded by the world. Tuesday morning dawned gray and cold, with clouds pressing low over Millbrook like a lid on a pot. Evangeline woke before sunrise, her stomach twisted in knots that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the appointment she'd made at the Silver Dollar Saloon. She dressed in her best remaining dress, a navy blue wool that had once belonged to her mother. The fabric hung loose. Now she'd lost weight since the accident, partly from worry and partly from eating only one meal a day to make her money last. The dress needed taking in, but sewing required sitting still for long periods. And sitting still meant thinking about things she preferred to avoid. Through her small window, she could see Daniel Reed's wagon, parked beside Murphy's Tavern. He'd been working on modifications to the building's front steps since dawn, the sound of his hammer providing a steady rhythm that somehow felt reassuring. She'd watched him work yesterday afternoon, noting how he approached each task with methodical care, as if every nail mattered, as if the work itself was a form of respect for whoever might need those steps. The morning passed slowly. Evangeline tried to eat breakfast but could only manage a few sips of weak coffee. She attempted to read, but the words on the page refused to hold meaning. Finally, she gave up pretending she could concentrate on anything other than the approaching noon hour. At 11:15, she made her way downstairs, using the new handrail Daniel had installed along the narrow staircase. The improvement was subtle, but significant. She could move more confidently now, without having to grip the wall for support. Daniel was packing his tools into his wagon when she stepped outside. He looked up as she approached, and she saw his gaze take in her good dress and carefully arranged hair. "Heading somewhere special?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I have an appointment," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Business matter." Daniel set down the hammer he'd been holding and studied her face. "What kind of business?" The question was asked gently, but Evangeline felt heat rise in her cheeks anyway. "Nothing improper," she said quickly. "Just employment possibilities." At the Silver Dollar, she stared at him in surprise. "How did you—" "Small town," Daniel said simply. "People talk, and when a young woman gets dressed up to meet strangers at a saloon, folks notice." Shame washed over her in waves. Of course people had noticed. Of course they were talking about her desperation, speculating about how far she might fall. "It's just a meeting," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his scarred hands busy with unnecessary adjustments to his tool arrangement. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and non-judgmental. "Miss Patterson, I've been in enough difficult situations to know that sometimes we tell ourselves stories to make hard choices seem easier." "You don't understand," Evangeline said, anger flaring suddenly. "You have work. You have skills people need. You don't know what it's like to be—" She stopped herself before saying useless, but the word hung in the air anyway. "Don't I?" Daniel's voice was quiet, but something in it made her look at him more closely. "You see a man with work and skills. I see someone who spent 2 years in a Confederate prison camp, who came home to find his farm sold and his fiancée married to someone else. Someone who's been drifting from town to town for 3 years, looking for a place that might still have room for damaged goods." The words hit her like cold water. She'd been so focused on her own pain that she hadn't considered he might have his own. "The scar?" she asked. "Knife fight in Abilene. Man called me a coward for surviving when better men died. Maybe he was right." Daniel's fingers touched the scar unconsciously. "Point is, I know something about being broken and trying to convince yourself that any solution is better than no solution." Evangeline stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The careful way he moved, the haunted look that sometimes flickered across his face, the reason he'd appeared in her life offering help from an anonymous benefactor who probably didn't exist. "There is no anonymous benefactor, is there?" she said. Daniel met her gaze directly. "No, ma'am, there's not." "Then why?" "Because 3 weeks ago I was ready to put a bullet in my head rather than face another winter alone and useless," he said with brutal honesty. "And then I heard about you, about someone who wasn't letting the world decide what she was worth." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Evangeline felt her anger drain away, replaced by something more complicated: recognition, perhaps, or the strange comfort that came from meeting someone who understood what it felt like to be discarded. "So you decided to save me instead?" she asked. "No," Daniel said firmly. "I decided maybe we could save each other." The church bell began to toll noon, each chime echoing off the buildings around them. Evangeline looked toward the Silver Dollar Saloon, where someone was waiting to discuss employment that would solve her immediate problems while destroying everything else. "I have to go," she said. "I gave my word." "I know," Daniel replied. "But remember that giving your word to hear someone out isn't the same as giving your word to accept what they offer." She nodded, though her stomach was churning with anxiety. As she started toward the saloon, Daniel's voice stopped her. "Miss Patterson." When she turned back, he was holding something, a small wooden object carved with intricate detail. "Made this for you. Thought you might like to have it." She took the carving and felt her breath catch. It was a bird in flight, its wings spread wide, every feather individually detailed. The wood was smooth as silk and warm from his hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Daniel said simply. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The Silver Dollar Saloon sat like a tumor on Millbrook's Main Street, its painted facade trying too hard to look respectable. As Evangeline pushed through the batwing doors, the smell hit her: first tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and something else she couldn't identify but instinctively disliked. The main room was larger than she'd expected, with tables scattered across a sawdust-covered floor, and a long bar that reflected the pale light filtering through dirty windows. A few men sat nursing drinks despite the early hour, their conversations stopping as she entered. She could feel their eyes following her as she made her way toward the back of the room, where a well-dressed man sat alone at a corner table. Marcus Caldwell looked exactly like what he was, expensive and dangerous in equal measure. His suit was cut from fine cloth, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his hair slicked back with pomade that smelled like roses and money. But his eyes were cold as January ice, and when he smiled, Evangeline thought of wolves evaluating sheep. "Miss Patterson," he said, rising as she approached. "How delightful to finally meet you. Please, sit." She took the chair he indicated, conscious of how her homemade dress and worn shoes must look compared to his obvious wealth. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from a bottle on the table but didn't offer her anything, studying her with the frank assessment of a buyer examining livestock. "You're smaller than I expected," he said finally, "but that might work in our favor." "I don't understand, Mr. Caldwell. Your advertisement mentioned domestic work." "Oh, there's work involved," he said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "My establishment in Dodge City requires young women to provide companionship to lonely travelers. Entertainment, you might say." The word entertainment fell between them like a stone down a well. Evangeline felt her mouth go dry as understanding began to dawn. "I see you're beginning to comprehend the nature of the position," Caldwell continued, his voice as smooth as his expensive clothes. "Room and board provided, of course, along with a generous percentage of earnings, enough to afford whatever medical treatments you might require." His gaze lingered meaningfully on her wooden leg, and Evangeline felt heat flood her face. She'd been naive to think the advertisement meant anything innocent, naive to believe she had other options. "I'm not that kind of woman," she said quietly. Caldwell's laugh was like breaking glass. "My dear girl, you're exactly that kind of woman. You're desperate, you're damaged, and you're running out of alternatives. Those are the only qualifications that matter." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. Around them, the saloon had grown quiet, as if the other patrons were straining to hear their conversation. "Think about it practically," Caldwell continued, refilling his glass. "What other options do you really have? Charity work that pays nothing? Marriage to some farmer who'll see you as a burden? At least with me, you'll earn enough to buy yourself a decent prosthetic, maybe even put some money aside." He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table toward her. "Take your time deciding, but don't take too much time. Winter's coming, and opportunities like this don't wait for anyone." Evangeline stared at the card without touching it. Everything Caldwell had said was true, which made it worse somehow. She was desperate, she was damaged, and she was running out of alternatives. But somewhere in her coat pocket, Daniel's carved bird seemed to grow warm against her fingers. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course you do," Caldwell replied, standing as she rose from her chair. "But while you're thinking, remember something. The world doesn't owe you anything just because you've suffered. At least I'm offering you a chance to be useful." As she walked toward the saloon doors, Evangeline could feel his eyes on her back, calculating and patient. Outside, the October air felt clean after the stale atmosphere of the silver dollar, but her hands were shaking as she made her way down the street. Daniel's wagon was gone from in front of Murphy's Tavern, but she could see him working on Mrs. Henderson's front porch 2 blocks away. Something about the sight of him steady, reliable, treating broken steps with the same care he'd shown her carved walking stick, made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. She climbed the stairs to her room, using his new handrail, grateful for its solid presence beneath her palm. Once inside, she sat on her bed and pulled Caldwell's business card from her pocket, staring at the elegant script that spelled out her potential damnation. The carved bird sat on her washstand, its wooden wings frozen in eternal flight toward some destination she couldn't see. Daniel had made it for her, spending hours on details that no one else would ever notice, creating something beautiful simply because he thought she deserved to own something beautiful. But beauty wouldn't pay for food or shelter. Beauty wouldn't buy medicine or warm clothes or the prosthetic leg that might give her back some measure of independence. Beauty was a luxury she couldn't afford. She tucked Caldwell's card into her Bible and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself thinking about Daniel's confession, about his admission that he'd once been ready to end his own life, rather than face another winter of uselessness. Maybe that was the real difference between them. He'd found a reason to keep fighting, while she was still looking for hers. Outside her window, afternoon shadows were growing longer, and somewhere across town, Marcus Caldwell was probably counting on desperation to make her decision for her. But first, she needed to understand exactly what Daniel Reed was offering instead. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, sending Evangeline bolt upright in her narrow bed as horses thundered past Murphy's Tavern at full gallop. Through her window, she watched 3 riders in dark coats disappear around the corner toward the edge of town, leaving behind only dust clouds and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Something was wrong. In Millbrook, people didn't fire guns unless they were hunting or in trouble, and hunting season didn't start for another month. She dressed quickly, her wooden leg protesting as she hurried down the stairs Daniel had modified just days before. The main room of the tavern buzzed with worried conversations as men clustered around Murphy, who was wiping his hands on a bar towel with shaking fingers. "What happened?" Evangeline asked, pushing through the crowd. "Bank robbery," Murphy said, his Irish accent thicker than usual when he was upset. 3 men with their faces covered rode right up to Harrison's bank, bold as brass, shot the lock clean off the door, and made off with the strongbox. Old Pete Watkins spat into the sawdust at his feet, sheriffs already forming a posse. But those boys had fast horses and a good head start. Evangeline felt her stomach drop. The bank held what little money remained in Millbrook farmers' savings, merchants' deposits, the small fund the church had been building to hire a proper school teacher. If the money was gone, the whole town would suffer. "How much did they take?" she asked. Murphy's expression grew grim. Everything Harrison had in the vault, near on $2,000. The number hit her like a slap. $2,000 was more money than most people in Millbrook would see in their entire lives. It was enough to rebuild the church that had been damaged in last spring's tornado. Enough to improve the roads. Enough to bring real prosperity to their struggling community. And now it was gone. Stolen by men who probably cared nothing for the dreams and hard work that money represented. "There's more," Murphy continued, lowering his voice. "Harrison says he recognized one of them, Marcus Caldwell." The name sent ice through Evangeline's veins. The man who had offered her employment just yesterday, the man whose business cards still lay hidden in her Bible upstairs, was apparently also a thief. "That can't be right," she said. Mr. Caldwell was well-dressed, respectable. He had money of his own. Pete Watkins laughed bitterly. "Dressed like a gentleman, maybe. But Harrison got a good look when the man's bandana slipped. Same scar on his hand, same gold tooth. It was Caldwell, all right." Evangeline's mind raced. If Caldwell was a criminal, then his offer of employment had never been legitimate. He'd been sizing her up for something else entirely, perhaps as an accomplice, or as someone desperate enough not to ask questions about where his money came from. The realization made her feel sick and strangely relieved at the same time. She'd been saved from making a terrible mistake, but now she was back where she'd started, broke, desperate, and running out of options. "Miss Patterson?" Dr. Morrison's voice cut through her troubled thoughts. "I need to speak with you privately." She followed him outside, where the October morning was crisp and bright, despite the drama that had shattered the town's peace. Dr. Morrison was a thin, serious man who delivered her into the world 22 years ago, and had been trying to keep her in it ever since. "I heard what Murphy said about Caldwell," he began without preamble. "I also heard you met with him yesterday." Heat flooded Evangeline's cheeks. "Nothing happened. I just listened to what he had to say." "I'm sure you did." Dr. Morrison's tone was kind, but firm. "But I want you to understand something. Men like Caldwell prey on desperation. They look for people who have run out of hope and offer them solutions that create more problems than they solve." He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small bottle of clear liquid. "This is laudanum, pain medicine. I've seen too many people turn to it when life becomes unbearable, thinking it will solve their problems." Evangeline frowned, not understanding why he was telling her this. "The medicine works," Dr. Morrison continued. It takes away pain, makes everything seem manageable for a while. But it also takes away your ability to think clearly, to make good decisions. Before you know it, you need more and more just to function. And eventually, it destroys everything you were trying to protect. The parallel hit her like a cold wind. Caldwell's offer had been like laudanum, a temporary solution that would have caused more damage than it prevented. What am I supposed to do then? She asked. Wait for charity? Hope someone takes pity on me? You're supposed to remember that temporary problems don't require permanent solutions, Dr. Temper, Morrison said gently. And you're supposed to trust that sometimes help comes from unexpected places. As if summoned by his words, Daniel Reed's wagon came around the corner, moving at a pace that suggested urgency without panic. He pulled up beside them, his scarred face tight with concern. Heard about the robbery, he said, climbing down from the wagon seat. Everyone all right? Shaken but unharmed, Dr. Morrison replied, though the town's treasury is considerably lighter. Daniel's eyes found Evangeline's face, and she saw recognition there. He understood that the stolen money represented more than currency. It represented the difference between hope and despair for people who were already struggling. There's something else, Dr. Morrison said. The sheriff thinks one of the robbers was Marcus Caldwell. Daniel's expression didn't change, but Evangeline saw his hands tighten on his wagon's reins. The man who wanted to hire Miss Patterson? The same one, Dr. Morrison confirmed. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, considering the implications. Then Daniel spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Seems like someone was looking out for you yesterday, Miss Patterson, keeping you from making a choice you might have regretted. Or maybe I was just lucky, she replied. Maybe, Daniel agreed. But I've noticed that luck has a way of showing up when people are brave enough to keep looking for better alternatives. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. Speaking of alternatives, I have a proposition for both of you. They looked at him expectantly. The robbery has left our community in a difficult position, he continued. We're going to need to pull together, help each other through the winter. I'd like to propose an arrangement. He turned to Daniel first. The church needs extensive repairs from the spring tornado damage. The congregation can't pay much, but they can provide room and board for a skilled carpenter willing to do the work. Then he looked at Evangeline. And Miss Patterson, I've been thinking about starting a small medical practice here in town. I need someone to help with patient records, prepare medications, assist with simple procedures. The work would require intelligence and steady hands, not necessarily two good legs. Evangeline felt her heart skip. You're offering me real work? I'm offering you the chance to learn a useful skill while helping your community, Dr. Morrison said. The pay wouldn't be much at first, but it would be honest work that builds towards something better. Daniel was studying both of them with interest. And you're suggesting we both stay in Millbrook through the winter? I'm suggesting that sometimes the best way to solve individual problems is to work together on community solutions. Dr. Stocking, Morrison replied, the church needs repair, the town needs medical services, and both of you need purpose. Seems like a natural fit. A new possibility was taking shape, one that didn't involve charity or degradation or running away to somewhere else. Evangeline felt the carved bird in her pocket, its wooden wings suddenly seeming less like a symbol of escape and more like a reminder that even broken things could soar if they found the right wind. I'll need to think about it, she said. Of course, Dr. Morrison replied, but don't think too long. Winter waits for no one. As he walked away, Daniel stepped closer to Evangeline. What do you think? I think I'm tired of being afraid, she said quietly. Tired of letting other people decide what I'm worth. Fear's not always a bad thing, Daniel observed. Sometimes it keeps us from making stupid mistakes. The trick is learning when to listen to it and when to ignore it. They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Sheriff Johnson rode up with his hastily assembled posse, their faces grim with determination. Behind them came a wagon carrying supplies for what might be a long pursuit. Any word on which direction they headed? Daniel called out. South toward Dodge City, the sheriff replied. But they could have turned off anywhere. Country's too big and we're too few. As the posse rode out of town, Evangeline watched them disappear into the vast Kansas landscape. Somewhere out there, Marcus Caldwell was riding free with stolen money, probably laughing about the desperate girl he'd tried to recruit just one day before. But instead of anger, she felt something else, relief mixed with determination. She'd come close to making a choice that would have destroyed her, but she'd been saved by circumstances beyond her control. Now she had a chance to make a different choice, one based on hope instead of desperation. Daniel, she said suddenly, yesterday, when you told me you'd been ready to give up, what changed your mind? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the dust clouds raised by the departing posse. I realized I was looking at the problem backward, he said finally. I kept thinking about what I'd lost, what I couldn't do anymore. But loss only matters if you're not willing to find something new to replace it. And did you find something new? Daniel looked at her then, his storm-gray eyes serious and kind. I'm starting to think maybe I did. The words hung between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Evangeline felt her pulse quicken, not with fear this time, but with something warmer and more dangerous, the possibility that she might not have to face the future alone. Dr. Morrison's offer, she said. Do you think it's real? Not charity disguised as work? I think Dr. Morrison is a smart man who recognizes useful skills when he sees them, Daniel replied. And I think he's right about community solutions being stronger than individual struggles. A cold wind picked up, reminding them both that winter was approaching, whether they were ready or not. But for the first time in months, Evangeline didn't feel the seasonal change as a threat. Instead, it felt like a deadline, time to make decisions, time to choose a direction, time to stop drifting and start building something solid. I have one condition, she said. What's that? If I stay? If I take Dr. Morrison's offer, you have to promise me something. Daniel waited. Promise me you'll stop thinking of yourself as damaged goods, she said. Because if you're damaged, then so am I. And I'm tired of living like broken things can't be useful. A slow smile spread across Daniel's scarred face. Deal, he said. But only if you promise the same thing. They shook hands on it. A formal agreement that felt like the beginning of something neither could quite name yet. As they stood there in the October morning light, Evangeline realized that for the first time since her accident, she was making a choice based on what she wanted rather than what she feared. It felt like the most radical thing she'd ever done. The storm hit Millbrook 3 days later, like a freight train made of ice and fury, turning the October afternoon black as midnight and sending everyone scrambling for shelter. Evangeline was in Dr. Morrison's office, learning to measure powders for pain medicine, when the first lightning bolt split the sky so close she could smell the electricity in the air. Get away from the windows, Dr. Morrison ordered, but his words were drowned out by thunder that shook the building's frame like a giant's fist. Through the office window, Evangeline could see Daniel across the street, racing to secure loose boards from his church repair work, as wind strong enough to lift a grown man whipped through the town. The storm had come from nowhere, or at least from nowhere they'd been able to predict. 1 minute the sky had been gray and threatening, the next it was spawning tornadoes. A tremendous crash made them both duck as something heavy slammed into the side of the building. When they looked outside again, a large tree branch had punched through the window of Henderson's general store, sending glass sparkling across the sidewalk like deadly diamonds. We need to get to the church basement, Dr. Morrison shouted over the howling wind. It's the only building in town with a proper storm cellar. But before they could move, the door burst open, and Marcus Caldwell stumbled inside, his expensive clothes torn and muddy, his face streaked with blood from a cut above his left eye. Behind him came 2 men Evangeline didn't recognize, both carrying guns and looking like they'd rather use them than talk. Well, well, Caldwell said, wiping blood from his face with a dirty handkerchief. Look what the storm blew in. Dr. Morrison stepped protectively in front of Evangeline. Mr. Caldwell, I understood you'd left town rather suddenly. Temporary absence, Caldwell replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Had some business to attend to. But the storm caught us on the road back, and we needed shelter. Through the windows, they could see other townspeople running for the church, their forms bent against the wind like broken trees. But Caldwell's men had positioned themselves between the door and the office's occupants, making escape impossible. Funny thing about storms, Caldwell continued conversationally. They tend to wash away evidence, destroy records, make it hard to prove things that might have happened recently. Evangeline felt ice form in her stomach. The bank robbery money was probably hidden somewhere nearby, and Caldwell was planning to wait out both the storm and any investigation before retrieving it. We don't want any trouble, Dr. Morrison said carefully. Of course you don't, Caldwell agreed. You're respectable people, law-abiding citizens, the kind who see things but keep their mouths shut if they know what's good for them. Another lightning strike illuminated the office in stark white light, and in that moment Evangeline saw something that made her blood run cold. One of Caldwell's men was holding a rope, the kind used for hanging people. They weren't just hiding from the storm. They were planning to make sure no witnesses survived to identify them. The thing is, Caldwell continued, as if discussing the weather instead of murder, Miss Patterson here has already seen too much, had too many conversations with the wrong people. That makes her a liability. Dr. Morrison's hand moved toward the medical bag, where he kept a small pistol for emergencies, but Caldwell's men were faster. One of them had his gun trained on the doctor before he could complete the motion. Now, Caldwell chided. Let's not do anything foolish. This can be simple and quick, or it can be slow and unpleasant. Your choice. The storm raged outside with increasing violence, rattling the windows and drowning out any sounds that might bring help. Evangeline realized that even if people in the church could see what was happening, they couldn't reach the office without risking their own lives in the tornado-strength winds. You made one mistake, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. Caldwell raised an eyebrow. And what's that, my dear? You assumed I was helpless because I'm missing a leg, Evangeline replied. But people with disabilities learn to fight differently. We learn to use what we have instead of mourning what we've lost. Before anyone could react, she grabbed the heavy brass mortar and pestle from Dr. Morrison's workbench and hurled it at the nearest window. The glass exploded outward, letting in a rush of wind and rain that knocked over bottles and scattered papers throughout the office. In the confusion that followed, Dr. Morrison lunged for his medical bag, while Evangeline swung her carved walking stick like a club, catching one of Caldwell's men across the shins hard enough to send him stumbling backward into a cabinet full of medical supplies. You little Caldwell started, but his words were cut off by a new sound that made everyone freeze. Gunshots. Multiple gunshots, coming from the direction of the church. Through the broken window, they could see muzzle flashes in the darkness. Someone was fighting back against the storm, and whatever else had come to Millbrook in its wake. Posse's back, one of Caldwell's men said nervously. We need to get out of here. But Caldwell's attention was fixed on Evangeline, with the intensity of a man who didn't like being surprised by people he'd underestimated. You think you're clever, don't you? But you're still just a crippled girl playing at being brave. Maybe? Evangeline replied, shifting her weight to her good leg and gripping her walking stick like a weapon. But I'm a crippled girl who's got nothing left to lose. That makes me dangerous. The standoff might have continued, but Mother Nature intervened with another lightning strike that hit so close the building's oil lamps flickered and went out. In the sudden darkness, everyone moved at once. Evangeline heard Dr. Morrison's pistol fire, followed by cursing and the sound of breaking furniture. She swung her walking stick in the direction where she'd last seen Caldwell, felt it connect with something solid, and heard him grunt with pain. Then strong hands grabbed her arm, and a familiar voice said, "This way. Now, Daniel." Somehow, in the middle of the chaos, he'd made it across the street and through the broken window. He pulled her toward the opening as wind and rain lashed through the office like nature's own weapon. "Can you climb?" he shouted over the storm. "Do I have a choice?" Together, they struggled through the window frame, Daniel supporting her weight as broken glass tore at their clothes. Behind them, she could hear Caldwell screaming orders and Dr. Morrison's pistol firing again. The street was a river of mud and debris, with the wind strong enough to knock them down if they weren't careful. Daniel wrapped his arm around her waist, and together they fought their way toward the church, where lights flickered in the basement windows like beacons of safety. But they'd only made it halfway when Caldwell appeared behind them, his face a mask of rage and blood. He'd lost his hat, and his expensive coat was torn, but he still held a gun with steady hands. "You cost me everything!" he screamed, his words barely audible over the storm. "The job, the money, my reputation." The gun came up, pointing directly at Evangeline's back. In the lightning flashes, she could see his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. She thought about the carved bird in her pocket, about the medical work she was just beginning to learn, about all the conversations she and Daniel would never have if Caldwell's bullet found its mark. Then Daniel stepped sideways, putting himself between her and the gun just as Caldwell fired. The shot was lost in a crack of thunder, but Evangeline saw Daniel jerk and stumble. Dark stains spread across his shirt as he fell to his knees in the muddy street. "Daniel!" She dropped beside him, her wooden leg making her awkward but not stopping her from pressing her hands against the wound in his shoulder. Blood seeped between her fingers, warm and frightening in the cold rain. Not as bad as it looks," Daniel gasped. Though his face was pale as old paper, Caldwell was reloading his gun when the church doors opened and Sheriff Johnson emerged with 3 members of his posse, their rifles trained on the street. The lawmen had returned from their pursuit just in time to witness attempted murder. "Drop your weapon!" the sheriff commanded. For a moment, Caldwell seemed to consider fighting. His eyes darted between the armed men, the storm, and the wounded carpenter bleeding in the street. Then, with a curse that would have made a sailor blush, he threw down his gun and raised his hands. "You haven't won anything," he snarled at Evangeline as the deputies moved to arrest him. "He'll die anyway. Look at him bleeding in the mud like a dog." "Maybe," Evangeline replied, applying pressure to Daniel's wound with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. "But he'll die free, which is more than you can say." As the posse led Caldwell and his men away, the storm began to lose its fury. The wind dropped from a howl to a moan, and the lightning moved off toward the eastern horizon. Dr. Morrison appeared with his medical bag, kneeling beside Daniel in the muddy street to examine the bullet wound. "Clean through the shoulder," he pronounced after a few minutes. "Missed the bone and the major blood vessels. He'll live, though he'll be sore for a few weeks." Relief flooded through Evangeline with such force that she almost collapsed. Daniel would live. The robbery money would be recovered. Caldwell would face justice for his crimes. The nightmare was over. But as she helped Dr. Morrison move Daniel to a stretcher, she realized something had changed in her as well. Somewhere between throwing the mortar through the window and pressing her hands against Daniel's wound, she'd stopped thinking of herself as a victim. She'd discovered that courage wasn't about being unafraid, it was about being afraid and acting anyway. "Why?" she asked Daniel as they carried him toward the doctor's office. "Why did you step in front of that gun?" Daniel's eyes met hers, clear despite the pain. "Because some things are worth protecting," he said simply, "and you're one of them." The words hit her like sunshine after rain. For the first time in her life, someone had risked everything to keep her safe. Not out of pity or obligation, but because he believed she had value worth defending. As the last of the storm clouds moved away, and stars began to appear in the clearing sky, Evangeline realized she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Someone who saw her as she really was, and chose to love her anyway. The future was still uncertain, winter was still coming, and she still had only one good leg. But for the first time since her accident, Those facts felt like inconveniences rather than disasters. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't won by the strongest or the fastest or the most whole. Sometimes they're won by the people who refuse to give up, who find strength in unexpected places, and who learn that the greatest victory is not in being saved, but in discovering you have something worth saving in the first place. "He's asking for you again," Dr. Morrison whispered, stepping out of the back room where Daniel had been recovering for 3 days since Caldwell's bullet tore through his shoulder. Evangeline looked up from the medical ledger she'd been updating, her pen hovering over entries that documented the town's slow healing after the storm. Outside, November wind rattled the windows with promises of harder weather to come. But inside the doctor's office, warmth from the wood stove made everything feel safe and manageable. "How's the fever?" she asked, setting down her pen. "Breaking. Finally. But he's been delirious, talking about things that happened during the war." Morrison's expression grew troubled. "Some of what he's saying, well, it explains a great deal about why he came to Millbrook." Through the partially open door, Evangeline could hear Daniel's voice, low and urgent, speaking to people who weren't there. She'd heard fragments over the past few days, names of dead soldiers, apologies for surviving when others didn't, desperate pleas for forgiveness that broke her heart. "Should I go to him? I think it might help." Sometimes familiar voices can anchor people when they're lost in bad memories. The back room was small and dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Daniel lay on a narrow bed, his shoulder wrapped in white bandages that Dr. Morrison changed twice daily. His face was flushed with fever, and sweat dampened his dark hair despite the room's coolness. "Johnny, you need to keep your head down," he mumbled, his eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids. "They've got sharpshooters in the tree line." Evangeline pulled a chair close to the bed and took his uninjured hand in both of hers. His skin was hot and dry, and she could feel the rapid pulse at his wrist. "Daniel," she said softly, "you're safe. You're in Dr. Morrison's office in Millbrook. The war is over." His eyes opened suddenly, but they were looking at something she couldn't see. "Evangeline? You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "I'm right here," she said, squeezing his hand gently, "and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, his gaze seemed to focus on her face. "The storm. Caldwell. The storm's over. Caldwell's in jail. You saved my life." Daniel's expression grew agitated. "Couldn't save them. Couldn't save any of them. Why me? Why did I get to come home when better men died?" The pain in his voice was so raw that Evangeline felt tears sting her eyes. She'd wondered what demons drove him to drift from town to town, what made a skilled carpenter live like a man without a home. Now she was seeing the answer: survivor's guilt so deep it had nearly destroyed him. "Maybe you survived because you had something important to do," she said quietly. "Maybe you were supposed to be here, in this moment, helping people who needed you." "I'm no hero," Daniel whispered. "I'm just a coward who was too afraid to die." "You stepped in front of a gun for me," Evangeline reminded him. "That's not something a coward does." His fever-bright eyes searched her face. "You could have died because of me, because I brought trouble to your door. I could have died because I was too proud to accept help when it was offered. The trouble was already at my door, Daniel. You just helped me see it clearly." Over the next several hours, she stayed beside his bed, speaking quietly about small things, the progress on the church repairs, the patients who came to Dr. Morrison for treatment. The way November light looked different from October's golden glow. Gradually, his fever broke, and his breathing became easier. When he finally woke completely, his eyes were clear for the first time in 3 days. "How long was I out?" "3 days. You had us worried." Daniel tried to sit up, winced, and settled back against his pillows. "Dr. Morrison says the shoulder will heal clean, no permanent damage. That's not the only thing that needs healing, is it?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling while shadows from the oil lamp danced across his face. "I never told you about the prison camp," he said finally. About what happened there. You don't have to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm despite his weakness. If there's going to be anything between us, you need to know who I really am. So he told her. About the Confederate prison in Georgia where he'd spent 2 years after being captured at Gettysburg. About watching good men die from disease and starvation while he somehow survived. About the day he'd fought another prisoner over a scrap of moldy bread and killed him with his bare hands. I became an animal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I did things that would make you sick to hear about. And when the war ended and they let us go, I couldn't figure out how to be human again. Evangeline listened without judgment, her hand steady in his as he laid bare the darkest corners of his soul. When he finished, the room was silent, except for the wind outside, and the steady tick of Dr. Morrison's clock. Do you want to know what I see when I look at you? She asked finally. Daniel nodded, though he looked terrified of her answer. I see a man who survived hell and came out the other side with enough compassion left to help a stranger. I see someone who learned that life is precious because he's seen how easily it can be lost. I see a person who understands that healing takes time and that broken doesn't mean worthless. Tears slipped down Daniel's cheeks, the first she'd ever seen him shed. I don't deserve your forgiveness. That's not for you to decide, Evangeline said gently. Forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we accept when someone chooses to give it freely. The next morning brought news that would change everything again. Sheriff Johnson arrived at Dr. Morrison's office with a telegram from the territorial judge, his expression grim as he handed the yellow paper to the doctor. What does it say? Evangeline asked, though she already dreaded the answer. Dr. Morrison read the telegram twice before speaking. Judge Harrison is ordering Caldwell released on bail pending trial. Seems he has influential friends in Topeka who've posted bond. The words hit Evangeline like ice water. He's getting out? After everything he did? Territorial law, the sheriff said apologetically. Without direct witnesses to the bank robbery, we can only hold him on the assault charges. And assault with a firearm carries bail provisions if the defendant has sufficient resources. From the back room came the sound of Daniel struggling to get out of bed despite his injured shoulder. Evangeline hurried to help him, finding him trying to pull on his boots with one hand. You can't be serious, she said. Dr. Morrison said you need at least another week of rest. Caldwell won't wait a week to finish what he started, Daniel replied grimly. He'll come for you the moment he's free. Then we'll be ready for him. The voice came from the office's front door, where Mrs. Henderson stood with her husband and half a dozen other townspeople. Word had spread quickly about Caldwell's impending release, and the community was rallying in ways that surprised everyone. We've been talking, Mrs. Henderson continued, stepping into the office with the determination of a general preparing for battle. Millbrook takes care of its own, and that includes both of you. What followed was the most extraordinary display of community solidarity Evangeline had ever witnessed. The townsmen organized watches to ensure someone was always guarding the doctor's office. The women prepared meals and medical supplies. Even the children contributed, serving as messengers between the various groups coordinating the town's defense. Why? Evangeline asked Mrs. Henderson as they prepared bandages in case violence erupted again. Why are people willing to risk so much for us? Mrs. Henderson's hands paused in their work. Child, you've been thinking about this all wrong. You keep seeing yourself as someone who needs protecting, someone who's a burden on others, aren't I? You're the girl who threw medical supplies at armed robbers to create a distraction. You're the woman who stayed calm enough to treat a gunshot wound while a storm raged around you. You're the person who's been keeping Dr. Morrison's records so well that he's thinking of making you his permanent assistant. The words washed over Evangeline like revelation. She'd been so focused on what she couldn't do that she'd missed seeing what she could accomplish. As for Daniel, Mrs. Henderson continued, he's the man who's been quietly helping everyone in town with repairs and improvements. never asking for payment, never making anyone feel like they owed him anything. You two aren't burdens, dear. You're examples of what people can become when they refuse to let circumstances define them. That evening, as November darkness settled over Millbrook like a blanket, Evangeline sat beside Daniel's bed and realized something fundamental had shifted between them. The crisis had burned away pretense and polite distance, leaving something raw and honest in its place. When this is over, Daniel said quietly, when Caldwell is dealt with and the town is safe again, I want to ask you something important. Ask me now. I want to know if you'll marry me. Not because you need protection, or because I need someone to take care of, but because I love you, and I think we could build something good together. The proposal hung in the air between them, simple and honest, and terrifying in its implications. Evangeline thought about all the reasons she should say no: her disability, their uncertain future, the dangers that still surrounded them. Then she thought about the way he'd stepped in front of Caldwell's gun, about the careful respect he'd shown her carved walking stick, about the hours he'd spent creating something beautiful just because he thought she deserved to own beautiful things. Yes, she said, and the word felt like coming home. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise that winter's hardest tests were still ahead. But inside the warm circle of lamplight, two people who had learned that broken things could still be strong were planning a future built on love instead of fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Caldwell would be free, dangerous, and seeking revenge. The community's resolve would be tested, and choices would have to be made that could determine the fate of everyone Evangeline had come to care about. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't afraid of what morning might bring. Marcus Caldwell walked out of the territorial jail at sunrise, his expensive clothes pressed and his gold-topped cane clicking against the frozen ground like a countdown to catastrophe. Word reached Millbrook by telegraph within the hour. The most dangerous man in 3 counties was free and heading their direction, with money in his pocket and murder in his heart. He's not coming alone, Sheriff Johnson announced to the emergency town meeting gathered in the church basement. Telegraph operator in Junction City says he hired 6 men, professional gunfighters, by the look of them. The news sent murmurs of fear through the assembled crowd. Millbrook was a farming community, not a frontier garrison. Most of the men owned hunting rifles, but few had experience with the kind of violence Caldwell was bringing to their doorstep. "Why doesn't he just leave us alone?" young Tommy Henderson asked, his 14-year-old voice cracking with anxiety. "He got away with the money. Why come back?" Dr. Morrison stood to address the crowd, his medical bag at his feet and his face grim with understanding. Because men like Caldwell can't tolerate being beaten by people they consider inferior. Evangeline outsmarted him, Daniel outfought him, and our community stood together against him. That's not something his pride can accept. From her seat near the front, Evangeline felt the weight of every eye in the room. These people were preparing to risk their lives because she'd refused to disappear quietly. The responsibility felt crushing. "Maybe I should leave," she said, standing despite Daniel's protests from his chair beside her. "If I'm not here, he'll have no reason to threaten anyone else." "Sit down, child," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. Running away never solved anything, except to teach bullies that intimidation works. "Besides," added Pete Watkins, checking the load on his old cavalry pistol, "this stopped being about just you the moment he robbed our bank. Caldwell made it personal for all of us." The discussion that followed revealed both the town's strengths and its limitations. They had perhaps 20 men who could handle weapons, a good knowledge of the local terrain, and the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. But they lacked experience with organized violence and faced opponents who killed for money. "What about the cavalry post at Fort Hays?" suggested the pastor. "Surely they'd send help if we requested it." Sheriff Johnson shook his head. 30 miles away, and they're dealing with Indian troubles further west. Even if they agreed to come, it would take days to organize and travel here. "Then we fight with what we have," Daniel said, struggling to his feet despite his injured shoulder. But we fight smart, not heroic. Over the next 6 hours, Millbrook transformed itself into something approaching a fortress. The men positioned themselves in buildings along Main Street, creating overlapping fields of fire. The women and children gathered in the church basement with supplies and medical equipment. Dr. Morrison set up a field hospital in the back room of his office, while Evangeline helped prepare bandages and organize medications. But as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, doubts crept in like cold through poorly sealed windows. "I keep thinking about what Caldwell said," Evangeline confided to Daniel as they checked the defenses around Dr. Morrison's office. "About me being damaged goods, worthless except for what men like him could use me for." Daniel stopped adjusting the boards they'd nailed over the windows and looked at her directly. "And what do you think now?" "I think," she paused, searching for words that felt true instead of brave. "I think maybe worth isn't something other people get to decide. Maybe it's something we discover by choosing to act like we matter, even when we're scared, especially when we're scared." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through a gap in the boarded windows, they could see 7 riders coming down Main Street at an easy pace, their confidence evident in every casual movement. Caldwell rode in the center, his gold-topped cane gleaming in the late afternoon sun, flanked by men whose faces showed the hard indifference of professional killers. The riders stopped in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, dismounting with the unhurried movements of people who had all the time in the world. Caldwell stepped onto the wooden sidewalk and used his cane to knock against the saloon's front door in a pattern that sounded almost polite. "Citizens of Millbrook," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I've come to collect what's mine. Send out the crippled girl and the broken soldier, and the rest of you can go about your business in peace." Silence answered him, broken only by the wind and the nervous shifting of horses. "I'm not an unreasonable man," Caldwell continued, beginning to pace back and forth like a lawyer addressing a jury. "I understand that sentiment and misplaced loyalty might make you hesitate. So I'll give you a demonstration of what happens to communities that harbor fugitives." He nodded to one of his men, who pulled out a bottle filled with clear liquid and a burning rag. The improvised bomb arced through the air and crashed through the front window of Henderson's general store, followed immediately by the whoosh of flames catching on dry goods and wooden fixtures. "That's just the beginning," Caldwell shouted over the crackling fire. "I have enough men and enough bombs to burn this entire town to the ground, all to protect 2 people who aren't worth the match it would take to light their funeral pyres." Evangeline felt sick as she watched smoke pour from the store that had been like a second home to her. Mrs. Henderson had shown her more kindness than she deserved, and now the woman's livelihood was burning because of choices Evangeline had made. "I have to go out there," she told Daniel. "No." His voice was flat and final. "That's exactly what he wants. People are going to die because of me." "People are going to die because of him," Daniel corrected. "Don't take responsibility for another man's evil choices." But before they could argue further, the situation changed again. From the direction of the church came the sound of children screaming, followed by gunshots and adult voices raised in alarm. Through their observation post, they watched one of Caldwell's men emerge from the alley behind the church, dragging young Tommy Henderson by the collar. The boy's face was white with terror, and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "Seems we've found some additional motivation," Caldwell called out, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Young Thomas here was trying to play hero, sneaking around with messages between your defensive positions. Now he's going to help me demonstrate the consequences of defying Marcus Caldwell." The man holding Tommy drew his pistol and pressed it against the boy's head. In the terrible silence that followed, everyone in Millbrook could hear Tommy trying not to cry. "You have 1 minute to send out the girl and the soldier," Caldwell announced, "or the boy dies and we start working our way through every child in this town until you give me what I want." Evangeline was moving toward the door before she realized she'd made the decision. Daniel caught her arm, but she shook him off with surprising strength. "I won't let a child die from my mistakes," she said. "It's not your mistake. It doesn't matter whose fault it is. What matters is stopping it." But as she reached for the door, Daniel stepped in front of her. "If you're going out there, you're not going alone. Daniel, you can barely stand. Then we'll fall down together." The simple words carried such weight that Evangeline felt tears threaten. Here was a man willing to die beside her, not because he thought she needed protection, but because he believed she was worth dying for. "There is another way," Dr. Morrison said quietly from behind them. "A way that might save Tommy without sacrificing either of you." They turned to look at him, hope and desperation warring in their expressions. "Caldwell wants revenge more than he wants murder," the doctor continued. "He wants to prove he's superior to people he sees as inferior. What if we gave him the chance to do that publicly, with the whole town watching?" "What do you mean?" "A duel. Old-fashioned, formal, with rules and witnesses. His pride against yours. Winner takes all." Daniel shook his head immediately. "I can't outdraw a professional gunfighter with a bullet wound in my shoulder." "Not you," Dr. Morrison said, looking directly at Evangeline. Her. The suggestion was so unexpected that for a moment, neither of them could respond. "She doesn't know how to fight," Daniel began. "She doesn't know how to fight with guns," Dr. Morrison corrected. "But she knows how to fight with her mind. And she has something Caldwell doesn't. A community that believes in her." Through the window, they could see Caldwell checking his pocket watch with theatrical patience, while his man kept the gun pressed against Tommy's head. Time was running out, and their options were disappearing like snow in spring sunshine. "What exactly are you proposing?" Evangeline asked. "Challenge him to single combat, not with guns, but with a test of skill and intelligence. Make it public, make it formal, and make the stakes clear. If you win, he and his men leave town forever. If he wins, he gets to kill me in front of everyone. Yes." Evangeline looked out at the burning store, at the terrified boy with a gun to his head, at the community that had risked everything to protect her. Then she looked at Daniel, whose scarred face showed a mixture of terror and pride that told her everything she needed to know about his feeling. "What kind of contest?" she asked. Dr. Morrison smiled grimly. "Leave that to me. I have an idea that might just work." Outside, Caldwell's voice rang out again. 30 seconds, good people of Millbrook. Then the boy's blood is on your hands." Evangeline took a deep breath, feeling the carved bird in her pocket and thinking about all the ways a person could choose to fly, even with broken wings. "Tell him I accept his challenge," she said. "But not on his terms, on mine." As Dr. Morrison moved toward the door to deliver her message, Evangeline realized that whatever happened in the next hour would determine not just her fate, but the kind of person she chose to be in the moment when choosing mattered most. The game was about to begin, and for the first time since Caldwell had entered her life, she held the cards that would determine how it ended. "The girl wants to make a deal, Dr. One," Morrison shouted across the street, his medical bag clutched in one hand and a white cloth waving from the other as he stepped into the deadly space between the buildings, where armed men waited on both sides. Marcus Caldwell's eyebrows rose with amused interest as he watched the doctor approach. Behind him, Henderson's general store continued to burn, sending black smoke into the November sky like a funeral pyre for the town's innocence. The gunman holding Tommy Henderson kept his weapon steady, but Caldwell raised a hand to signal patience. "A deal?" Caldwell called back, his voice carrying the tone of a man who enjoyed having all the advantages. "How refreshing. I was beginning to think the people of Millbrook preferred martyrdom to common sense." Dr. Morrison stopped in the middle of Main Street, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to avoid any sudden violence. "Miss Patterson challenges you to single combat. Winner takes everything her life if you win. Your promise to leave this town forever if she wins." Caldwell's laughter rang out like breaking glass. "Single combat? What does a crippled girl think she can do against a man who's killed dozens of people? Not with guns, Dr. Morrison continued, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. With intelligence. A test of skill that proves who's truly superior. The suggestion clearly intrigued Caldwell. His grip on his gold-topped cane shifted, and his cold eyes took on the calculating look of a gambler considering an interesting wager. What kind of test? Medical knowledge, Dr. Morrison replied, producing a small black bag from his coat. She's been learning to assist with treatments and procedures. You claim to be superior to everyone in this town. Prove it by demonstrating knowledge that could save a life. For a moment, the street fell silent, except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of people moving in the buildings around them. Caldwell's men exchanged glances that suggested they thought their boss was considering something foolish, but none dared speak. You want me to play doctor with a farm girl who can barely walk? Caldwell said finally. I want you to prove you're as intelligent as you claim to be, Dr. Morrison replied. Unless you're afraid a crippled girl might know something you don't. The challenge hit its mark. Caldwell's face flushed with anger, and his hand tightened on his cane until his knuckles went white. Fine, he snarled. But when I win this ridiculous contest, I'm going to kill her slowly, and then I'm going to burn down every building in this pathetic excuse for a town. And if she wins, she won't. But Caldwell's men didn't look entirely convinced. The smartest killers were the ones who survived by avoiding unnecessary risks. And their boss was walking into a situation where he might lose face even if he won the larger conflict. 20 minutes later, the strangest duel in Kansas Territory history began in the space between Dr. Morrison's office and the burning general store. Word had spread through hidden signals, and faces appeared at windows throughout the town, drawn by the bizarre spectacle of a criminal overlord preparing to match wits with a disabled farm girl. Dr. Morrison had set up a makeshift examination area using a table from the Silver Dollar Saloon and medical supplies from his office. On the table lay a man who'd been shot during the initial confrontation, one of Caldwell's own gunfighters, wounded when the town's defenders had returned fire. The rules are simple, Dr. Morrison announced to both contestants and the hidden audience watching from every available window. This man has a bullet wound in his abdomen. Whoever can correctly diagnose the internal damage and provide the most effective treatment wins. Evangeline approached the table with her characteristic uneven gait, her wooden leg announcing each step on the frozen ground. She'd left her carved walking stick behind, forcing herself to rely on balance and determination alone. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled on the clean gloves Dr. Morrison had provided, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I'll need better light and clean instruments. Caldwell stepped up to the opposite side of the table, his expensive clothes looking absurdly formal in the medical setting. This is ridiculous. I'm not a surgeon. Neither is she, Dr. Farr, Morrison replied evenly. But intelligence isn't limited to formal training. It's about observation, reasoning, and the ability to make correct decisions under pressure. What followed was unlike anything the people of Millbrook had ever witnessed. Evangeline began her examination with careful, methodical movements, her hands exploring the wounded man's abdomen while her mind processed what she felt. She'd spent weeks learning from Dr. Morrison, absorbing knowledge about anatomy, infection, and trauma treatment. Entry wound is here, she said, pointing to a small hole in the man's right side. But there's no exit wound, which means the bullet is still inside. The question is what it hit on the way in. Caldwell's examination was more aggressive, his movements rough and impatient. Obviously, the bullet hit something important, or he'd be dead already. Just dig it out and sew him up. It's not that simple. Evangeline replied, pressing gently around the wound site. Feel here the abdomen is rigid and distended. That suggests internal bleeding, possibly from the liver or intestinal damage. So what? Caldwell snapped. Cut him open and fix whatever's broken. Dr. Morrison watched the exchange with growing interest. Miss Patterson, what's your diagnosis? The bullet entered at an angle that would have taken it through the liver's left lobe, she said, her confidence growing as she spoke. But the patient is still conscious, and his pulse is steady, which suggests the bleeding isn't immediately life-threatening. The bigger risk is infection if we operate without proper preparation. And your recommended treatment? Stabilize him first, clean the wound thoroughly, give him laudanum for pain, and monitor for signs of shock or increased bleeding. Surgery should wait until we have proper lighting and sterile conditions. Caldwell scoffed. That's the coward's approach. Real doctors take action instead of waiting around for perfect conditions. Mr. Caldwell, Dr. Morrison said formally, what's your diagnosis and treatment plan? The man's gut shot and needs the bullet removed immediately, Caldwell replied, with aggressive certainty. Cut him open, pull out the lead, and sew him back up. Simple. And the risks of that approach? Sometimes you have to take risks to save lives. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Both approaches have merit, but there's one more test that will determine the winner. He reached into his medical bag and pulled out a small bottle filled with clear liquid. This patient has been given a dose of what appears to be morphine for pain relief. However, one of these bottles contains actual morphine, and the other contains a deadly poison that looks identical. The person who correctly identifies which is which wins the contest. The announcement sent murmurs of shock through the watching crowd. Even Caldwell's gunmen looked uneasy at the prospect of their boss playing with poison. How are we supposed to tell the difference? Caldwell demanded. Knowledge, Dr. Morrison replied simply. Real medical knowledge that goes beyond surface appearances. Evangeline stared at the two bottles, her mind racing. She'd learned enough from Dr. Morrison to know that several poisons could mimic the appearance of medical drugs, but telling them apart required understanding their specific properties. May I smell them? She asked. Dr. Morrison nodded, holding out the first bottle. Evangeline inhaled carefully, noting the faint, sweetish smell that she recognized from her weeks of training. This one smells like bitter almonds, she said. That suggests cyanide, which would appear clear like morphine, but carries a distinctive odor. Caldwell grabbed the second bottle and took a deep sniff. They both smell the same to me. That's because you don't know what you're looking for, Evangeline replied, her confidence building as pieces of knowledge fell into place. The real morphine should have a slightly bitter smell, but not the almond scent. Also, if you hold the bottles up to the light. She demonstrated, tilting both containers toward the afternoon sun. Real morphine has a very slight yellowish tint in certain lighting conditions. Pure cyanide solution stays completely clear. The crowd held its collective breath as Evangeline reached for the bottle she believed contained morphine. Her hand was steady now, driven by the certainty that comes from knowledge properly applied. I choose this one, she said, holding up the second bottle. Caldwell's face had gone pale as he realized he was losing a contest he'd expected to dominate through intimidation alone. This is all just guesswork. Anyone could make lucky guesses. Then prove it, Evangeline challenged. Take a sip from the bottle you think is safe. The dare hung in the air like a challenge to a duel. Everyone watching understood that this moment would determine not just the contest's outcome, but the balance of power in a conflict that had already cost the town too much. Caldwell stared at the bottles, his earlier confidence cracking like ice in spring sunshine. He'd built his reputation on violence and intimidation, but those tools were useless against someone who simply knew more than he did. I don't have to prove anything to you people, he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Yes, you do, Evangeline replied quietly, because knowledge is the only kind of power that can't be stolen or bought. It has to be earned through patience and practice and caring enough about other people to learn how to help them. Dr. Morrison stepped forward with a gentle smile. For what it's worth, Miss Patterson is correct. The bottle she chose contains morphine. The other would have killed anyone who drank from it within minutes. The admission shattered whatever remained of Caldwell's composure. In front of his own men and half the town, he'd been outmatched by someone he'd dismissed as worthless. The humiliation was complete and public. witnessed by people who would carry the story throughout the territory. "The contest is over," Dr. Morrison announced. "Miss Patterson has demonstrated superior knowledge and judgment. According to the agreed terms, Mr. Caldwell and his men must leave Millbrook immediately and never return." For a moment, it seemed like the crisis might end without further violence. Then Caldwell's hand moved toward the gun under his expensive coat, his face twisted with rage at being beaten by someone he'd considered beneath his notice. "I don't honor deals made with cripples and cowards," he snarled. "Kill them all." But his men had seen enough. When your boss gets outsmarted by a farm girl in front of witnesses, it raises questions about his competence that professional gunfighters can't afford to ignore. One by one, they began backing away from the confrontation, their hands carefully visible and empty. "Sorry, boss," one of them said, mounting his horse. "This job just got too complicated for the money you're paying." As his hired guns abandoned him, Caldwell found himself alone in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by an entire community that had finally seen him for what he really was, a bully whose power depended on other people's fear. The ending came quickly after that. Without his gunmen to provide backup, Caldwell was just one man, with a weapon facing an entire town that had learned to stand together. Sheriff Johnson emerged from his hiding place with handcuffs, and this time there would be no bail, no legal technicalities, no escape. As they led Caldwell away, Evangeline sank into a chair that someone had brought for her, suddenly aware of how much the confrontation had cost her, physically and emotionally. Her wooden leg ached, her hands were trembling with delayed reaction, and she felt hollowed out by the intensity of the past hour. But she also felt something else, a quiet satisfaction that came from proving something important to herself. She'd faced down her worst fear and discovered that intelligence, properly applied, could be more powerful than violence or intimidation. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," Daniel said, limping over to kneel beside her chair despite his injured shoulder. "It was the most terrifying thing I've ever done," she replied honestly. "Sometimes those are the same thing." As the sun set over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Evangeline realized that something fundamental had changed in how she saw herself and her place in the world. She was still missing a leg, still facing an uncertain future, still dependent on the kindness of others in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming. But she was no longer broken. Damaged, perhaps, but not broken. And sometimes that distinction made all the difference in the world. Spring came early to Kansas in 1868, arriving with wildflowers that painted the prairie in colors so bright they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Evangeline stood in the doorway of the small house Daniel had built just outside Millbrook, watching him work in their vegetable garden while their 3-month-old daughter slept peacefully in her arms. The house was modest but perfect, designed with wide doorways and gentle ramps that made her wooden leg less of an obstacle and more of a simple fact to be accommodated. Daniel had carved the prosthetic himself over the winter months, using techniques he'd learned from studying her original fence post creation and improving on them with hinges and padding that made walking feel almost natural again. "She has your stubborn chin," he called out, wiping sweat from his forehead as he paused in his planting. Evangeline smiled, adjusting baby Mary's blanket against the gentle breeze. "And your tendency to wake up at inconvenient hours." The past year had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined during those dark November days when Caldwell had threatened to destroy everything they cared about. The confrontation had revealed strengths they hadn't known they possessed and created bonds that went far beyond romance or convenience. Dr. Morrison emerged from the house behind her, carrying his medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose patient was healing exactly as expected. "How's the leg today?" he asked, nodding toward her prosthetic. "Better every week," Evangeline replied truthfully. Daniel's latest adjustments made a real difference. It was more than politeness. The wooden leg had evolved through multiple iterations, each one incorporating lessons learned from daily use. What had started as a crude survival tool had become something approaching elegance, functional art that enhanced rather than hindered her movements. And the practice? Dr. Morrison was referring to the medical clinic they'd established together in Millbrook's rebuilt commercial district. What had begun as emergency training during the Caldwell crisis had developed into a genuine partnership. Evangeline's careful hands and methodical mind made her an excellent assistant, while her personal experience with injury and recovery gave her insights that formal medical training couldn't provide. 3 patients this morning, she reported. Mrs. Wilson's arthritis is responding well to the willow bark treatment. Tommy Henderson needed stitches after his latest adventure with the Henderson boys. And old Pete Watkins finally agreed to let me look at that cough he's been hiding. The work was satisfying in ways she'd never expected. Each patient represented a puzzle to be solved, a problem that yielded to careful observation and methodical treatment. More importantly, it was work that mattered, healing that made a real difference in people's lives. Speaking of which, Dr. Plays, Morrison continued, I received a letter from the Territorial Medical Board yesterday. They're interested in our practice, particularly in your innovations with prosthetic devices. He handed her an official-looking envelope that she opened with growing excitement. The letter inside was formal but encouraging, inviting her to present her work at a conference in Topeka that fall. They want me to speak? She asked incredulously. They want you to teach, Dr. Morrison corrected. Other medical professionals are interested in learning techniques that could help their own patients with similar challenges. The idea was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. A year ago, she'd been ready to sell herself into degradation just to survive. Now, medical professionals wanted to learn from her innovations. Daniel approached from the garden, his hands still dirty from planting, but his eyes bright with pride as he read the letter over her shoulder. You're going to do it, aren't you? He said. I don't know if I'm qualified. You're the most qualified person in the territory. He interrupted gently. You've lived with challenges these doctors have only read about in textbooks, and you've found solutions that work in the real world, not just in theory. As if to emphasize his point, baby Mary chose that moment to wake up and begin demanding attention with the imperious cries of someone accustomed to having her needs met promptly. Evangeline adjusted her position, balancing the baby's weight against her hip in a movement that had become natural through months of practice. Watching her, Dr. Morrison smiled. You know, when I first suggested that medical work might suit you, I was thinking mainly about giving you a way to earn a living. I never expected you to become genuinely innovative in the field. Innovation comes from necessity, Evangeline replied, settling baby Mary into a more comfortable position. When you can't do things the standard way, you have to find new ways that work better. It was a lesson that extended far beyond medical practice. Their marriage had required similar innovations, finding ways to build a partnership that worked around their individual limitations, while maximizing their combined strengths. Daniel's carpentry skills complemented her growing medical knowledge. Her careful observation abilities enhanced his intuitive problem-solving approach. Together, they'd created something stronger than either could have managed alone. There's something else in the letter, Doctor, Morrison said, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. They're also interested in Daniel's prosthetic designs. Apparently, word has spread about the quality of his work. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. I just make things that work for Evangeline. I'm not a medical manufacturer. Maybe you should be, Evangeline suggested. There are people all over the territory who could benefit from prosthetics like mine. People who are stuck with crude alternatives or nothing at all. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Henderson, who approached, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and carrying news that would change their afternoon plan. Telegraph came in from Junction City, she announced, slightly out of breath from the walk. Marcus Caldwell died in prison last week. Tuberculosis, they said. The news hit them with complicated emotions. Caldwell had represented genuine danger, but he'd also been a broken man whose choices had cost him everything. His death felt like the closing of a chapter rather than a cause for celebration. "How do you feel about it?" Daniel asked Evangeline quietly. She considered the question seriously. "Sad, mostly. He could have been something better if he'd made different choices, but also relieved that we don't have to worry about him anymore." "Justice isn't always about punishment," Dr. Morrison observed. "Sometimes it's about preventing further harm and giving people the chance to build something better." As the afternoon wore on, neighbors began arriving for what had become a weekly tradition community gathering in the garden behind Daniel and Evangeline's house. The custom had started informally during the previous summer and had grown into something approaching a town institution. Tommy Henderson appeared with his latest carving project, a wooden bird that bore a striking resemblance to the one Daniel had made for Evangeline during their courtship. The boy had taken to woodworking with enthusiasm that reminded everyone of his teacher's patient approach to craftsmanship. "Miss Evangeline," Tommy said, holding up his creation, "do you think the wing position looks right?" She examined the carving with the careful attention she'd learned to bring to all detailed work. "The proportion is excellent, but see how this feather overlaps? In real birds, they layer differently to provide better aerodynamics." The correction was offered gently, the way she'd learned to provide feedback that educated rather than discouraged. Tommy nodded eagerly and began making adjustments, his young hands already showing the steady control that would serve him well in whatever craft he eventually chose. Around them, other conversations flowed like streams, converging into a river. Pete Watkins was discussing crop rotation with Daniel, while Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Morrison debated the merits of different medicinal herbs. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding music to the warm spring air. "You know what I love most about this?" Evangeline said to Daniel as they watched their community interact in their garden. "What's that?" "Nobody treats us like we're special or different anymore. We're just part of the community, contributing what we can and receiving what we need." It was true. The dramatic events of the previous year had been absorbed into the town's history, becoming stories to be told rather than current crises to be managed. She and Daniel had found their place in Millbrook's social fabric not as objects of pity or symbols of inspiration, but as ordinary people doing useful work and building a life together. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the gathering gradually dispersed. Neighbors headed home to their own families and responsibilities, leaving behind the comfortable quiet that comes after good conversation and shared fellowship. "Do you ever miss it?" Daniel asked, as they cleaned up the remnants of the afternoon. "Miss what?" "The excitement, the drama, the feeling that everything depended on what happened next." Evangeline considered the question while folding the blanket they'd spread for the baby. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but I don't miss the fear that went with it. I don't miss feeling like I had to prove my worth every day just to deserve basic kindness. And now? Now I know that worth isn't something you prove. It's something you live." As they prepared for bed that night, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the mirror Daniel had mounted at the perfect height for her use. The face looking back was older than it had been a year ago, marked by experience and responsibility, but also by confidence and contentment. The carved bird Daniel had given her during their courtship sat on the dresser nearby, its wooden wings forever spread in flight toward some unseen destination. But Evangeline no longer felt the need to escape to somewhere else. She discovered that home wasn't a place you found, it was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, with people who saw your value and helped you see it too. Outside their window, Kansas wind whispered through the prairie grass, with the eternal sound of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients to treat, new problems to solve. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of work well done and love freely given, Evangeline fell asleep, knowing that broken things could indeed become beautiful when they found the right place to heal. In the end, the most important discovery wasn't that she could walk again or work again or love again. It was that she'd never actually been broken at all, just bent for a while, waiting for the right conditions to straighten and grow toward the light.